Hello guys, and welcome back to the last part of the Flask tutorial. In this part we will have some discussion about pros and cons of Flask API and community, how to select a web framework, alternatives frameworks to Flask, and a comparison between Flask and Django, and finally we will talk about the installation part. So let's go ahead and talk about the pros and cons of Flask. Now let's start with the pros here. Flask is amazing for getting a project up and running quickly. There is nothing to configure it. If you need to build something quickly, Flask is a great framework for that. Also, Flask is very customizable and described as a bare bones, meaning that there is so much customization that you can do with a Flask to make things exactly how you want it and how you want to interact with your data. Flask is easy to learn for beginners. It can be used for blogging, commercial, and small websites. And lastly, Flask is WSGI compatible, meaning that you can use any sort of web server that is WSGI compliant to run your app. Now let's go ahead and cover the cons. Flask is limited support and not well documented. What was a pro, Flask is a bare bone. That can also be a con, because you have to build almost everything you want to do in Flask. If there is lots of different options that other developers have used before, you still have to create that yourself. Now there is lots of different buckets and dependencies that you can also bring into your project to try to use code from the other developers. But often there is not a set standard to say this is the Flask way. Then often you end up having to create your own setup there. And to go along with this, if you are working with any sort of database, there is absolutely no help from Flask. You have to write all your custom SQL statements, you have to create objects, turn them back into database data. It's a whole lot of work. And that's why it's not suitable for enterprise or industrial applications. Before 4 years, Flask was not widely used by web developers, and its community was not that big. But now, there is many users and developers who are using Flask as a backend framework for their websites. There is also now many tutorials in YouTube and in many websites about learning Flask. So if you get a problem with using it, don't worry, you will find the solution for it easily. And there is now many big companies using Flask in their server sites, such like Netflix, Reddit, Pinterest, and Zillow. If you are really interested to learn or work with another technologies which are similar to Flask, here you have some good alternatives framework, such like Django, Pyramid, and Falcon. Django is a high-level Python-based framework, which encourages rapid and clean development with a pragmatic design. We will talk more about it and compare it with Flask in the next slides. Pyramid is an open-source Python-based, which is flexible to use and suitable for large applications. And finally, you can try dealing with Falcon, which is reliable and high-performance Python web framework for building large-scale applications, backends, and microservices. Now we will talk about how to select a web framework. Learning Flask is easy since we have just to write short code lines, so it's easy to set up and easy to learn, and you can start with it quickly and understood fully what your application is doing. And that's why Flask has more stars on GitHub now than any other Python-based web framework. About productivity, Flask is fully compatible with Python libraries, and that's why it's highly scalable. Flask has also many of dependencies and extensions such like Jinja, Werkzeug, and Clicks. These dependencies offers you fast development. They works like a helpful libraries to make the usage of Flask codes much easier and faster to implement. Flask is used mostly to implement small projects and to create websites quickly. About the security, you can install an optional Flask extension which adds basic security and authentication features to your Flask apps quickly and easily. So let's take this comparison between Flask and Django. So if you are confused which one to use for your web application, this comparison might be helpful to you. We will make the comparing based on their features. So this first point here is the database. Django can be used with databases such as MySQL, Oracle, or SQLite. But on the other hand, if your application needs no SQL database, then Flask is the best choice for this. One of this NoSQL example is MongoDB. Now, if you talk about the type of framework, Django is a full-stack web framework, hence slower, while Flask is a lightweight micro-web framework, hence faster. Now let's take the project size as a comparison. Flask is suitable for small projects and less complicated projects, such as blogging pages, social network pages, commercial websites, while Django is better suited for handling large projects with larger themes that have longer lifetimes. If you talk about the application type, Django works well with full-featured web application and server-side templating. On the other hand, Flask is mostly for websites having static content. If we talk about RESTful API, Django uses REST framework, that is DRF, which is one of the most popular third-party Django packages. It's a framework used to expose Django models to a RESTful interfaces. It includes everything you need, such as views, serialized validation, authentication for building applications easily, while Flask has also a number of extensions as well, such as Flask RESTful and Flask Security. And finally, we come back to the main point, which is the performance. Flask in this case performs slightly better than Django because it has smaller and fewer layers. Last thing we want to mention in our Flask tutorial is how to install Flask. It's very quick and easy to install Flask. All you need is to use the last version of Python, and then within your preferred IDE, create your new virtual environment to manage the dependencies for your project. A virtual environments are independent groups of Python libraries, one for each project. Note that packages for one project will not affect other projects or the other operating system. Within the activated environment, open the terminal and write this code pip install Flask, and so on. Now Flask is installed. You will not need to install Jinja, Click, Werkzeug, Markup Save because they will be installed by default. Now you can write this code example in your IDE and start running your first Flask project. Here are some references and YouTube links that we have used in our slides. You can check them if you want to learn more about Flask.